All right, so thank you everyone for coming today. I'm Megan Haskins. I work at the University of Denver as a faculty developer. And with me is Liz. Liz, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. I'm J. Elizabeth Clark, and I'm from LaGuardia Community College, where I'm a faculty member, and I have been involved in our ePortfolio program since the early 2000s when we first put LaGuardia's program together. And I'm delighted to see you all today and delighted to be here.
Great. So if you haven't already, go ahead and put your name in the chat, and as well as kind of on a scale of 1 to 3, your comfort level with ePortfolios. Just a quick overview. So Liz and I are going to provide an introduction overview of the work that the task force has been doing, just so that we're all on the same page for kind of the background of how this all came about. And then we're going to talk about support and practice as the 2 main principles for the day. You'll notice there are other intersecting elements of other principles. So if you're familiar with other principles or you've attended those workshops, feel free to draw those connections out. And then Liz and I will provide some models of how we have used those principles in our own context. Then we'll give you time to do the same. So we understand the institutional context, your own role at the institution, all of those things play really important factors. So we want to make sure that you have time to apply this to your own work. Then we're going to go into a small group discussion where we sort of unpack that and talk about our own context, but then we think about some ways that we might be able to transfer the things that some people are doing maybe to your institution or to the institutions of others. And then we'll share out and wrap up. That'll be a good time to have questions, talk about what you've learned in the breakout rooms. And then we're also here to provide advice or thoughts on issues that come up in that conversation. There are materials available today at this tiny URL link. So practice and support materials is the URL. It doesn't have anything extra right now, so you don't need it. But if you prefer to advance slides on your own, you're welcome to go there. Just real quickly, we want to make sure that we establish some group agreements for this session. Here are the ones that we have come up with as a task force. So understanding that everyone is here to learn. Some of us are really new to this context. Some of us have been doing this for a while, but we're all here to challenge our preconceived notions and biases and to learn from one another. So on that note, we want to make sure that we're listening without judgment. We're open to receiving feedback. We discuss an argument, not a person. That can be a challenge when we're talking about institutional context sometimes. We want to keep details that people share in these breakout rooms confidential. So the breakout rooms will not be recorded. The main session will be. So that's the distinction. And then if you have any other suggestions, please put them into Zoom. And then the last thing I'll note, I mentioned this earlier, but if you prefer to remain anonymous as this is recorded, you can always change your Zoom handle and remain off camera if you would like.
Okay, so I'm going to just start us off by talking a little bit about the Digital Ethics Task Force, in case you are new to that. If you've been to some of these sessions before, of course, you do already have some familiarity with this. We are in a second iteration of the task force. So the original version of the principles was created by a task force and published in 2020. And the goal was really to guide students, professionals, educators, administrators, and platform providers in navigating ePortfolio practices across 10 digital ethics principles. And the original task force, I'm just going to pop those names into chat so you can see who worked on the first version. This is the 2021-2022 task force. So some folks like myself are new this year and really excited to be helping to build on the incredible work that the original folks did in drafting the principles. So there are 10 principles, and each principle has a statement and an overview. So in the statement and the overview, this is where you'll kind of learn what the principle is about. And then for me, I think one of the most helpful parts is then the strategies and the application. So more than just understanding, for example, today we're going to be talking about support, understanding support in theory, really digging into what does that look like on the ground and how is it applied at different campuses in different contexts. Then there are some scenarios, and I love these scenarios and case studies where we kind of look at this principle in action. So what does it look like if we think about support on one kind of campus, and then what happens when we transition that to a different context? How do we need to change our application of the principle based on that scenario and that context? And then there are always, of course, resources and further reading so that you can dig in more on your own. So today we're going to start off with two principles, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the support principle. Before we go to that, Megan, did you want to jump in on anything else about the principle overviews? Okay, great. So we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to start off by talking about the support principle this morning. So the support principle, when we're talking about support, we want to think about the fact that institutions need to devote resources to supporting ePortfolios. So that's a big basket, right? What does that mean if we're going to support ePortfolios? Well, we're talking about professional development. We're talking about thinking about how we make portfolios accessible. We're thinking about how we work with students and faculty and staff around informational literacy, around technological and digital literacies, around writing, and around teaching and learning. With the goal really being, how do we create inclusive portfolios and make sure that we have built-in alternatives for folks who have limited access to technology and the internet. So as we get started, we'd like to ask you to take 5 minutes to take a look at the principle, at this principle that we're going to be working with today. So I'm going to pop that link into chat for you, and I'm going to ask you to go ahead and click on it and take a look at the full principle. Okay, I'm going to ask us to come on back together and think a little bit about the support principle. So I am particularly fond of the support principle because I think it's something that at LaGuardia we have done really well. All of us in our institutions, whatever our relationship to ePortfolio, certainly have things that we do better and other places where maybe we need to focus and work on things. And it might be different at different times, right? Because as you build out ePortfolio programs over time, things are going to shift and change. But I think that thinking about support is something that we spent a lot of time on at LaGuardia. So I want to talk just a little bit about LaGuardia as a case study for this principle. So in general, at LaGuardia, we really try to take a whole college approach to ePortfolio. So we are trying to provide support to both faculty and students. That plays out in a lot of different ways. We have year-long professional development seminars. We also offer just-in-time seminars. So maybe something that's not a year-long pedagogical study of ePortfolio where you then apply it to your own curriculum, but maybe you need a workshop or a refresher on some piece of ePortfolio. We also try to pair ePortfolio consultants or student technology mentors with faculty who are working through technology issues to make sure that faculty feel comfortable with technology and with ePortfolio. But on the student side, and this is particularly important, LaGuardia is a large urban community college. We're situated in Long Island City, Queens, right on the East River. And many of our students come to us with a lot of need for technological literacy. And even if they already have technological literacy, there's a lot of financial need for computers. So a lot of our students we discovered during the pandemic did not have computers. We still have traditional computer labs at LaGuardia, which some campuses have done away with, but we have rooms where students can go and have access to whatever they need to get their work done. We also have a standalone ePortfolio lab that has drop-in hours for students. So really trying to attend to the fact that not everybody comes to campus with a laptop. Not everybody at home has high-speed internet, and making sure that there are places where students can get work done. In addition to that, also having places where students can get real-time assistance and help. So ePortfolio is really part of our culture as a campus. We start with portfolios in the first year. And in our first year seminar, our students receive an additional layer of support in what's called a studio hour, which is additional hands-on time where students are working with essentially a senior student, an ePortfolio consultant, who guides them through the process of creating their first ePortfolio. So when we think about support, we can really see at LaGuardia that we have invested heavily in ePortfolio support and structure across the college. But when I read the support principle, where I think we have a lot of room to grow and a lot of conversations we're having at the campus, we have room to grow in thinking about universal design and accessibility practices. So that's an area that we are having more and more conversation about and talking more about how we want to approach that with support for both faculty and students. So that's a little overview, a mini case study of thinking about support on one campus. And Angela, we use Digication, is our in-house platform. And Jeff Yan is here with us today, and I'm sure Jeff can answer questions about Digication if you have any. And I also just want to shout out that Pablo Avila is also in our group today. And Pablo is actually our ePortfolio director at LaGuardia. And so I'm so pleased that he can be with us today. And I'm sure he can jump in with any questions, with answers to questions as well.
Okay, so now we're going to transition over to the practice principle. The abstract is on the PowerPoint, but really the practice principle is about understanding that students are not going to come to an ePortfolio with all of the skills that they need to create the eye-catching, deep reflection, heavily engaged materials that we sometimes see. And one thing that I found when I started teaching ePortfolios, I would show students those excellent final products, and that was really intimidating to them because they didn't know how to get from where they were to the product that we were showing them. And so a lot of the practice principle when we were developing it was thinking about how do we kind of talk about scaling and scaffolding and skilling up in these different areas, while also attending to the fact that faculty have content that they're teaching in many cases in the ePortfolio classroom. So thinking about students as audiences, contexts, and constraints, I think is really, really important. So let's take a few minutes to read the practice principle. I think I have it already. Let me see. Yes. So I just put that in the chat, and we'll take about 5 minutes. If you don't mind just doing either a thumbs up or a done in the chat, just so I can sort of gauge where people are, that would be great. Okay, I'm seeing some dones and thumbs up. So I'm going to continue talking a little bit about how I've used practice. So just for full disclosure, I say the University of Denver because that's where I am now, but I was at Auburn University for a few years before this, and that's where I did a lot of this ePortfolio work. So when I worked at Auburn, I taught a first year seminar that was sort of centered on ePortfolios. Amy Chiquino has a great article about ePortfolios as the curriculum or a chapter that I recommend. But anyway, so when I started this, I started thinking about the fact that first year students are coming from a lot of different areas. Some of them are really comfortable with technology. Some of them didn't really use technology in their K-12 settings. Auburn also has a large rural population. So again, addressing that kind of Wi-Fi connectivity issue. And so I thought a lot about what students would need to learn to create an ePortfolio later. So my goal for my first year seminar, based on the content and based on the bandwidth that we had, was not to have a employee-ready ePortfolio at the end of their first year. And so instead, I sort of scaled the expectations to building the kind of stepping stones, I guess, to creating that ePortfolio. So these are the 4 kind of main things that I focused on. The first was file storage. So I do not mean this negatively towards students because I am the worst. If you looked at my desktop, you would wonder why I'm teaching this. But I taught students different options for file storage. So different folder settings, different ways to name their stuff. And I showed the example of the dissertation draft done, this one, for real, this one, right? Like all of those file names, not helpful. And so I taught them different options and I gave them choices and I had them select one and stick with it throughout the quarter. And so that was just one way of kind of introducing this curation and selection kind of principle of ePortfolios, and just helping make their lives a little bit easier in their everyday lives. I also introduced accessible and universal design. So part of this was just modeling it, right? Using headers in my documents, creating accessible PowerPoint slides, talking about font and color choice. I always joked with my students at Auburn's colors are navy and orange, and I always talk to them about how they should never ever use those together. That's not the choice that you should make. And so we talked about those kinds of things in really low stakes settings, and it helped to just kind of introduce them to the topic, but also embed it in the work that they were doing. So then, because I was teaching this, part of the assignments that they submitted, the expectation was that they used the headers in Word. So now they know how to use headers. I always talk in my faculty development role here about the fact that we cannot and should not assess students on things that we aren't teaching them. So you can't ask students to create a visually appealing ePortfolio if you aren't going to first show them what visually appealing actually means. And so thinking about how you can kind of break some of that stuff down. And then genre of reflection. So teaching them that reflection is a type of writing. It is I talked to them about why it's a genre and why it's different from just writing down your thoughts or however that works. And of course, I am indebted to the writing studies folks that know way more about this, but talking about low stakes writing assignments, I did exit tickets, think, pair, share. I created opportunities for reflection so that then when I asked them to reflect in the ePortfolio, it wasn't a new experience for them. There was already kind of a culture of talking about their experiences. So even if it was, hey, did you all go to the football game? What was that like? What was it like being in this huge crowd? How did, things like that, just small things. And one huge assignment that I loved that was so impactful for them is we annotated the syllabus in small groups and having them ask the question, like, what do you see on this page? What is impactful? What questions do you have? What is the most important thing on this page to you? That was a really great first day activity to help them learn, like, okay, I'm going to be talking and I'm going to be thinking actively in this class. This person is not going to just be talking at me. So just kind of building that culture. And then resource sharing. So one thing about ePortfolios, when done well at the institutional level, is there's support throughout the institution. Liz is a great example of that, right? But our students do not know about those opportunities. And honestly, our faculty oftentimes don't either. So if you're sitting here and you aren't sure what your resources are, then now is a good time to challenge yourself each week in your class, talk about a resource that's available for them. And then it forces you to learn about it too. When I came to DU, that's a lot of what I had to do, is to figure out what was here and what was offered. So don't just say there's tons of resources on campus, but instead kind of think about how you might weave that into the content or weave that into the assignments, so that they're taking advantage of those resources. So that's just kind of a few tips on how I have done this at the course level. And my encouragement to you, if you don't have a huge institutional commitment to ePortfolios, is that these are some small changes that you can make at the course level that can really impact students, even if you don't have a robust ePortfolio initiative on campus. So now we want to take a little bit of time for questions. Liz and I come from pretty different institutional contexts, so we're happy to talk a little bit about our own experiences, the principles specifically, and then after this, we're going to have you kind of shift and think about your own context and how that applies. So questions in the chat, or you can unmute.
We're also happy to take questions on the principles in general. If you don't have questions on the case studies or on our institutions, we're happy to take questions or comments or thoughts on the principles themselves.
Liz, I'm sort of curious about Sorry, there's another question too. Angela has a question in the chat, but I was wondering like because you use portfolios to do assessment across the college, like how does that then, does that then inform the kinds of support that you all have provided over time? Like how did those different support structures develop, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we have different support structures for different things. So in terms of assessment, we have ePortfolios built into the curriculum at different milestones where students are depositing, we call it depositing, different artifacts into the system. So for that, I mean, that interaction and that support really does not take a lot of time because the actual need to deposit is, I mean, it's a 10-minute, maybe a 10-minute activity. We send folks to classrooms so we can provide in-class classroom support, and that's something that Pablo coordinates. We also have really extensive resources available, including, I'm so excited, Pablo just called to my attention the other day. We have a series of different support videos, and we're now offering them in different languages. So that's a first for us under Pablo's leadership, and I think it's incredible. I'm so excited about that. But so we have videos, we have written instructions. Okay, so that's pretty basic, right? Like, how do you deposit something? But then support for like some of the stuff that Megan was talking about, the aesthetics of creating a portfolio, the look and feel of the portfolio, the kinds of assignments, that support structure is really different. So some of it might be a workshop. Some of it might be things that happen in class. So in my own classes, every ePortfolio assignment that we do in class together so that I'm providing hands-on support in a computer lab while that activity is happening. So that's been challenging. My own ePortfolio work during the pandemic has been challenging and not my best work because I have been on Zoom and it's been hard for me to interact in that same way with students. But I think that hands-on touch is really important to the work that we do in offering support. But it's different support for different kinds of ePortfolio activities.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So Jeff had a question in the chat of how do you explain ePortfolios to students? And then Mel had a question saying, oh no, I'm sorry. Who was it that had? Yeah, so how do you understand the different types of design for ePortfolios, job search, assignments, and PD? And I think that's sort of a combined question, right? So helping students understand what ePortfolios are broadly is one thing. So if you're kind of thinking it, I'm currently working on an institutional initiative. So it's like my marketing hat gets put on and I'm thinking about how I tell students that this can support them in internships and getting jobs, and it can house all of their materials over the next 4 years. We have Canvas shells or Canvas courses go away. They lose that content if they don't save it. So kind of talking to them about that curation and then that showcasing element and making that clear to students. But then Mel, to your point, I think that there are a lot of different kind of camps when it comes to different types of ePortfolios. And my approach is that there's no reason for a student to only have one portfolio, right? So to shout out Digication a little bit, Digication has this great interface where you can have multiple ePortfolios and you can easily copy and move things over to different portfolios. So there may be a version where your students have a course portfolio for different courses, but then they have a showcase portfolio and we talk to them in a capstone class maybe about how transitioning that material. Now, others might say that you can have one portfolio that sort of grows and changes over time. I've had students do that at different institutions. And so I think making the expectations clear, if you as a faculty member have clear expectations on what the ePortfolio is, and then also just like with any other assignment, giving them the why and making it really clear. If your goal in your class is not to use this as for employers, then say that, like I am assigning this ePortfolio so that you can work on curating your content, so that you can think about what matters and what you want to keep. Or this is a reflection portfolio. I want you to be working on your reflective practice and how you might expand that. So I think just making that really clear. And then when I taught first year seminar, told them, I do not want you, please do not show this to employers. This is not a final product situation. We're not doing that right now. So I am not going to grade you on design because that's not where we're at right now. And so that's a choice that you can make. Some people don't choose that option, but that's just kind of a few thoughts. Liz, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I'm a lot of what you said, but also for us is showing student portfolios through a gallery. So we curate student portfolios where students agree and they know that their portfolios are going to be public for people to look at. And students really learn by exploring those portfolios and thinking about them. And then for our students who are in first year seminar, also working with essentially student mentors, our ePortfolio consultants, who are students who've been through the process. So they are both modeling the process, but also talking about the value as they help students create their portfolios. And I think there's a lot of power in that peer-to-peer interaction.
My question is, what do you, I'm kind of starting this at the University of Arkansas. We don't have an ePortfolio program yet. So I taught it and kind of did what Megan did in that class. And I had not had a whole lot of experience myself with ePortfolio. So I was learning, building as I'm teaching them. And well, who are some vendors? I'm to the point now where we created an exploratory committee to select a platform. I feel totally out of my element doing that. I don't know where I'm going. I've even sent a message to this AAEEBL asking if they have a list of vendors that we can select from, but I haven't gotten a response. So just kind of need some guidance in that area if we can talk about that during this session.
Yeah, Angela, I'm happy to schedule a meeting to talk offline. Vendor choices are really hard because they're so contextual, right? Like some institutions are going to have different priorities based on what they're looking for. But DU, we just went through the RFP process, so the request for projects. Anyway, the RFP, I don't know what the initials stand for, but we basically just went through the whole selection, vetting candidates, going through the accessibility checks, all of that. Request for proposal. Yeah, Jeff knows, he reads them all the time. So yeah, I would be more than happy to talk to you about that because I can empathize with navigating that with limited support and limited maybe knowledge of how those contracts and stuff work. So happy to schedule that. AAEEBL doesn't do any kind of public platform promotion for a lot of reasons, as you can imagine. But I would be happy to talk offline about some of the different platforms that are more common that you see.
Yeah, and I'm happy to jump on that as well, Angela. I think in terms of the workshop today, we have some other stuff planned, but we're super happy to have that conversation. So at the end, if you want to stay on and give us your, we'll just set up a time and the three of us can jump on, and I'm happy to share. LaGuardia is in our third platform. So I can talk with you a little bit about that process and how we arrived where we are now. We've been with Digication for many years now, but I can help you, I can talk from our past experience about how we arrived in making our decision. No worries. I'm so glad that you asked. I really, really appreciate you. And we've all been there. And one of the things that I really value and love about AAEEBL and the ePortfolio community in general is that folks are always willing to help. And so I'm so happy that you asked, and we will give you our best personal experience to help you figure out the journey that you're going to be on. Okay, so we're going to ask you to do a little brainstorming now, thinking about our two principles. So we have a set of questions that are on this slide. If you are more comfortable reading that on your own, I'm also going to share a link to just a standalone listing of these questions. So if you're new to ePortfolio, how would you like to implement the support and practice principles on your campus? If you're already an ePortfolio practitioner, and I know many of you on today's Zoom are, how do you already implement support and practice principles on your campus? And then how might your ideas for support and practice work across contexts and institutions? So we're going to spend about 15 minutes brainstorming. So those are our large categories. So you're going to decide, are you new or you're already a practitioner? And then underneath each of those broad umbrellas, how might you intentionally engage with the support and practice principles? What would you need to make this happen if you're new? If you're already doing it, are there opportunities for revision or change? And then what are the barriers to support and practice in your context? It's going to look different for each of us. So we're going to give you a little time to think about that. And we're going to use that thinking work to then prepare to move into breakout groups where we will be talking about that. And what we would love for you to do, if you are comfortable with the technology, is we would love for you to grab a slide at this link and answer the questions. So if you follow the first link, it's just the brainstorming questions. If you follow that second link, that is going to take you to a set of Google slides, and we would like you to claim a slide, put your name on it, and then begin to explore the answers to those questions on the slide. If the technology feels overwhelming and that's not something you're comfortable doing, that's fine. Grab a piece of paper and go ahead and sketch your answers out. And then you'll be all set when we move into brainstorming groups. So we're going to take about maybe 10 minutes for brainstorming. And then we'll move into our breakout groups. And if you have any questions, Megan and I will be here. So feel free to go ahead and put questions in chat. All right, we're going to invite you to pause where you are and come on back together.
So now we're going to transition to the breakout rooms. I have just a few prompts here. Make sure you introduce yourself and a little bit about your institution, and share kind of where you're at with the brainstorming with the group. And then as you think about the principles, are there suggestions that you have for revision? What was really helpful about the principles? What was confusing? So one thing I want to note is one of our primary goals with the principles is that it's a living document. So that's why we have it on the platform that we have it on instead of just as a publication, because it's really important to us that this grows and changes. You think of COVID, for example, digital ethics is a whole nother conversation than it was pre-COVID. So please read these with a critical lens, share your feedback. We love to implement that. We're always changing them, currently changing them actually. So please think about that as well. We're going to spend a good bit of time here, almost 30 minutes. So I really encourage you to ask questions, talk about the problems that you're having, the challenges that you're encountering, share the resources that you've been using. This is really a time to collaborate and engage, because as we all know, ePortfolio work can be very siloed and very isolated. So now is the time to sort of open that up and get support from other people. So just on a logistics point, I'm about to open one breakout room. Myself and Angela, Colin, JW, and Mel are going to go. Liz's group is going to stay in this room just because we don't want to leave the main room empty in case anyone gets booted out and needs to come back. Have learned that from experience. So if those of you that get the room prompt can accept it, and then we'll come back into this space at the 20.
Megan, before you head to a breakout room, once we've got everybody, do you want to stop sharing? So in the main room, we can just see each other.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
I'm not seeing an option to join a breakout room.
Sorry, who said that?
Rachel,
Rachel, you're in a break.
Hello, I'm gonna pause the
Breakout room was great, and we're excited to all be back together, and let's talk about what we've learned and what we're thinking about. So we're curious about the strategies that you've already used in your local contexts, and we're also interested in why those strategies are useful and the issues and barriers that you have identified, and suggestions for revising strategies. So I know in our group, we actually didn't get to barriers or to revising strategies. So we'll just share those for the first time as part of this conversation. But we'd love to have a large group conversation, just thinking through some of what was shared in breakout rooms, and then also maybe pushing that a little further. So any thoughts? Yeah, Megan.
All right, so I'm going to try. I'm going to try to roll this all into one answer. So when I was talking, I had mentioned, we're really tasked with scaling up ePortfolio use at a large university, and we've done pretty well. And then Liz called out the fact that scale up does not show up in our principles. What happens when you successfully grow? Again, I mentioned we're 2 full-time people tasked with 27,000 students, and let's not even mention faculty and staff that were asked to also help create ePortfolios, right? So scale up should be added to these, and that would certainly help folks in our positions, because what I was going to suggest as a strategy or an obstacle is that this kind of decentralized approach, like we should have the central ePortfolio team, but increasingly we're seeing departments and colleges who want very targeted knowledge of their disciplines. We're working so closely with cybersecurity, and I'll tell you all, my dissertation was on Elizabeth I. I am not a cybersecurity professional. So if we could coordinate with colleagues who are in those departments, who are disciplinary experts, and then we bring that ePortfolio expertise and that pedagogical expertise, I think that would certainly help us with that issue as scale up. But of course, then the obstacle is funding and convincing people to care about pedagogy and assignment design in the middle of a pandemic. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and Colin, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm thinking about how that connects to what you were talking about how you go into the classrooms. It sort of is almost like a team teaching model for the workshops of Megan, Mize, and I actually had a side conversation about this yesterday, but I know ePortfolios and I can speak to ePortfolios, but you also need your professor to be speaking to the content and speaking about the why are we using ePortfolios in this class. And kind of thinking about how that team-based approach signals to students that this is not separate from the discipline or the course or the content, but it's an addition to, or it's connected in some way.
Yeah, I mentioned in our breakout that in my role as faculty member in our teaching and learning center, I will go into the classroom and help instructors. So like what Megan was explaining, kind of that team approach. So working with the instructor to find out their use, why they want to use it, the purpose, and then providing an overview to the students, providing them with some hands-on time and experience where the students can collaborate and work together in a lab setting. But then it does show the teamwork of faculty members as well. And I teach first year experience at our course, or at our college, and I've actually had some of my first year experience students in other courses like an ed program where they get to see me in person working with other instructors outside of just our FYE course. So every now and then I have that overlap of some of my students are in courses that I go help with as well. So that's kind of a cool aspect as well.
And one just note, as we're talking about scale, one model that I've seen that I think works really well, and Megan Mize, I know you guys have a version of this, is sort of like an ambassador or an intern or something like that, where students that have an ePortfolio, that have gone through the process of creating it, can go and kind of speak to classes about the experience of creating it. They can provide support. It's a really low stakes scale option. So if you're at an institution that doesn't have a lot of additional funding, it's a great way to get some students on board. We are not as cool as we wish we were on campus. And so by having students saying the value of it, those peer relationships can be really, really beneficial. And so there are a lot of different models out there for that. But if you're looking for ways to scale, and we know the feeling of I'm only one person, some student employees can be a great option. And Colin's point about first year experience, that's a great point to recruit them, because then you potentially get them for 3 years, which is just beautiful, and you don't have to retrain people all the time.
So in our group, we were also talking briefly about, Jeff raised the issue of assessment, right? And so I think this is also connected to scaling up and also connected to student ambassadors, is that I think that ePortfolios and assessment are a natural fit. And that's why a lot of us use ePortfolios for assessment. But also when ePortfolios get reduced to assessment, it adds to the like, this is a thing I have to do feeling. So I think it's really helpful when students are talking about those authentic, useful practices and experiences with ePortfolio, because it helps other students to think about the value instead of just like, oh, this is an assessment thing or something we have to do. Also, in our breakout group, Jeff referenced an article that Trent Batson had written about ePortfolios being hijacked by assessment. So if that was something that was of interest to anybody, I found the link. So, I do think that's part of scaling up. And for sure at LaGuardia, that's a tension that we've had, which is that like sometimes we are really focused on assessment for accreditation or for a program review. But when we're really focused on assessment, sometimes I feel like we lose some of the opportunities for talking about ePortfolios for teaching and learning. And I feel like we're in a constant pendulum between we're focused on assessment, then we're recalibrating back to teaching and learning, then we recalibrate back to assessment. And we haven't found a good in-between balance to kind of do both of those well at the same time. We're doing it well at the same time, but talking about it and really helping people to experience it that way. It is from 2007, Jeff. It's a really old article, but it's a great one. And it's a great reference, right? I mean, that ePortfolios being hijacked for assessment, that's a major issue that when campuses are just beginning portfolios, that often happens on campus. So I think it's a great reference, even if it's from 2007.
Yeah, I'll say it for the recording. I was echoing what Liz was saying, and saying we also see push to essentially turn portfolios into like glorified LinkedIn's or resumes, which reduces their ability to be these kind of metacognitive vehicles and make students aware of the fact that they're practicing digital literacies and think about visual design and accessibility. And of course, that's often related to things like retention and et cetera. So I think ePortfolios are an interesting artifact because they are the crux of a lot of institutional anxieties, and yet they can be a very useful pedagogical tool. So we have to sometimes clear the debris of all that external pressure to be like, and I mentioned in mine, when we do our workshops, we really stress what are some teaching and learning issues you might want to address, and then so bringing it back to like, how is this about learning, and the rest of it is kind of incidental. Like, not to say it's not valuable, but it just dominates the conversation and makes people tired of it. They don't want to engage, and yet I think the pandemic has made it really clear our students cannot sidestep knowing how to communicate and write online. So
can I ask a question? And it may be a kind of a not quite intuitive question here, especially at the ePortfolio workshop. I have seen in a number of cases in different institutions where some are having success by actually not using the terminology ePortfolio in some cases. And it's really to address exactly, Megan, what you were saying, which is when you say ePortfolio, there might be, and depend on the culture. At LaGuardia, ePortfolio means such different things than at a different university, for example. But at some places where you mention ePortfolio, person's already sort of walk the other way, or they are like, that's not me. I don't have time to write resumes for my students, right? And that sometimes is if you are going to step in, like, first step to basically have them slam the door in your face, it's tough. And so I have seen in some cases where this is now traveled to faculty development as well. So instead of even saying, I'm going to show you some new pedagogical tools, is to reach to them and say, what are those really cool pedagogical things that you're doing in your class? And the faculty member might go, oh, I do this journaling exercise with students, but I always do it on paper and in the classroom. And they go, oh, what if we provide you a digital tool to do this journaling? So now suddenly you're not telling them to do ePortfolio, you're giving them a tool to do something that they've already known and trusted, and you're just giving them a better tool to do that. But of course, at the same time, you're now introducing them the ability to do some social pedagogy that they couldn't do in paper before, right? And so I think that's really interesting, branching out of portfolios. So again, I sort of said it in the context of someone had said that there was no judgment here in the beginning of the meeting. I don't want to upset people by saying let's not call it ePortfolio, but I do feel like there's like a time for that, and it may be an opportunity for growth, actually.
Yeah, I couldn't even hold back my smirking, because it sounds like you're basically describing my life. Because to Liz's point, we had a failed ePortfolio initiative. Well, I wouldn't call it failed, but we have sort of this dissolving ePortfolio initiative on our campus, and there's a lot of initiative fatigue here. There have been a lot of 5-year plans, a new 5-year plan, that 5-year plan ended, and so people just quite frankly don't want another buzzword. And so my approach has actually been, the workshops and the faculty development is titled on what we're using ePortfolios to do. So I do assessment workshops for the people that want to talk about assessment. And then I'm just like, here's an option. If you wanted, you could do this on ePortfolio. But we know ePortfolio is the vehicle, right, for a lot of these things. And so, reflection, you want your students to reflect, Jeff, exactly. Here's a way that you could do this. Oh, you wanted them to do peer review? Wild, because this thing also does peer review, and so I think that, yeah, there's veggies hidden under the pizza. Perfect, Megan. I think that's, but it's fair, right? Because there are faculty that they are at capacity. They do not have the capacity to learn a whole new initiative, a whole new approach to teaching. They just moved themselves to Canvas during the pandemic and they're overwhelmed. And so I think by thinking about the way that we present this stuff is actually really important. And it's important to our students too. I mean, if on day one we say, all right, you're going to build a personal website and then you're going to get a job. Like, that is a very overwhelming thing to say. So I think that while it can sound like, why would we not front load ePortfolios? It is important to remember, like, where are people feeling comfortable? Where is the solid ground for them? And what's a logical kind of next step? Because asking them to take a leap isn't going to work right now. Not in 2022, not in the middle of a pandemic, not now. So I think that's an important thing to consider. And it's something I wrestle with frequently is the messaging for this.
I agree with that, Megan. But I want to layer onto that. And what I want to layer onto that is Jeff talked about, and I wrote about in my brainstorming, and I saw it came up for some other folks too, that when we're thinking about the support and practice principles, Pablo and I have for many years worked on ePortfolio together at LaGuardia, but this year, as a direct result of the pandemic, We are also working on the online learning committee together, and we're also working on the college's brand new IT advisory committee. And an issue that has come up in all three contexts is that for LaGuardia, a real growth area is universal design and accessibility. And I really think, without any judgment, I know that people are going to hear judgment in what I'm saying, but I do not mean it, and I include myself in it. I think a lot of us have developed essentially bad practices during COVID because we were under pressure. We had to make something work. So, for example, if you had not chosen to teach online and you are now online and you didn't have a student in your class who is deaf, then the last thing you were thinking about was subtitling your videos, because you were creating videos for every class for the first time ever, right? And so I think within the confines of the pandemic, that was fine. But as we move out of the pandemic, I think it's also a time where we need to be reintroducing, okay, like if you did that during the pandemic, no judgment, you did what you needed to do. But now, if this is something that you are going to choose to continue to do, if you want to choose to continue to use these tools, this is now an aspect that we really need to wrestle with. And I feel like for us, just from anything from our course management system all the way through ePortfolio, it's really going to be a growth area for us. But I also feel like people have initiative fatigue, exactly what you said, Megan, and people have pandemic fatigue, and people have just-in-time fatigue, right, of all these things that we've been doing. But this is a piece that we can't afford to be fatigued on. Like, now we've got to really step up and figure this out. And I think on our campus, we have a lot of thinking to do around that.
And, we've stayed away from the checklist approach. Like we always say, we don't want these principles to feel like a checklist. And there are versions of this work that lend themselves to that. Like our campus, we have an accessibility technologist, a job that came as a product of the pandemic. And she's working on a Canvas accessibility checklist. So like, you do not get to use Canvas if you did not caption your videos, if you did not do these things. Obviously, we're not barring access to Canvas, but I'm just saying, like, we're trying to weave in, how do we say this is not negotiable? And I just need to name that I'm feeling hypocritical as I'm saying this, because I'm realizing that we did not enable live transcripts even on this Zoom in this moment. So to Liz's point, like, this is new territory even for a lot of us who have been working on this. And so combining that messaging with also thinking about what are those checklist things that need to be done. And we've been thinking about that for our students a lot with ePortfolios. We have an accessibility checklist at Auburn that, alt text on images, heading use, all of that kind of stuff, that just is a part of what they do. And it makes it a little bit more reasonable for the faculty because they can see what they need to do. Because I think accessibility feels scary if you don't want to mess it up and you don't know what to do. And there's not always a place on campus for people to go. Like our disability services is there. I think they have like 2 people right now because of the great resignation, great reshuffling, whatever you want to call it. So there's not always a version where we rely on them anymore. So yeah, Liz, that's a great point and an important point. Also, I'm going to enable live captioning now. So.
Thank you. Are there other things that came up in your small group around barriers or opportunities for revision that you want to highlight?
I have one. We didn't discuss it. And I love that now it's transcribed so everyone can hear me stumble through this. But we've kind of hit on the fact that ePortfolios, in their kind of multimodal nature, are almost always instantly judged by their visuals. And there's work on how that can negatively impact students, both in terms of identity, but also just a lack of visual design, et cetera, which, is a skill set. It's whole fields. And for us, we would love to work with, something we kind of rock tumbled in the future is trying to find our graphic design professors or even the clubs on campus and trying to integrate that more because no one faculty member can know all the things. It's just too interdisciplinary an assignment, which is its value, but also its obstacle. But I do think we've seen it in assessment where people will, inherent bias will sometimes come out because they don't like the color combination, or that student didn't understand information hierarchy or layout. And so I think, Megan, it was you who said, I always try to combat, did you teach them that? Then you can't grade them on that, right? But it's still something that I think needs to be flagged, because portfolios make visible things that other assignments would not. And so really trying to find ways to make sure that we train everyone at the institution to recognize, how are you reading this? This is different from reading an essay, and we bring different assumptions to something that's inherently identity oriented and visually oriented. And I just think that's going to be a bigger conversation in the near future.
Yeah, and going back to the assessment piece and the support piece, thinking about how we support faculty in the assessment side of ePortfolios is really, really, really important, right? So, there are different versions of that, but we did an assessment institute where we brought together faculty from across disciplines to use a rubric on ePortfolios. And we talked about, like, if you are assessing the ePortfolio, you don't get to then open up the assignments and assess the assignments. And so talking about what is it that we're assessing on this portfolio, and then, talking about the line between, is the visual design, do you not like it, or does it take away from the content, and can you point to why? And so there's a really great opportunity for some collaborations with your institutional research or assessment office, whatever they're called on your campus, to do some of that training on norming, especially those of you that are talking about doing this at the departmental level, thinking about how you do rubric norming, how you do that kind of assessment across the discipline is really important.
Well, I also think it's connected directly to, in the principles, developing clear ePortfolio requirements, right? So, I mean, both for the institution as well as for programs and for individual courses, that if there are going to be expectations around visual literacy, then visual literacy, right, and visual rhetoric needs to be part of the ePortfolio composition process. And if it's not, then, Megan, I'm feeling very judged by your orange and blue example. I had an early website that was all orange and blue because they're my favorite colors. Not something I would do today, but something I did do, right? But really helping students to think about that and to make that part of the conversation.
Yeah, and also just back to the practice, I have screenshots from early portfolios where I pull them up and I show students, like, I picked the curls font because I wanted to look fun. I have since learned that is neither fun nor accessible, And so I think that modeling the progression of learning these things is a great opportunity to just be a human and show students what we're talking about. I always use the example of cropping. They use their prom photos and they crop whoever is in their prom photo out, and that's their professional photo. Those are examples that we can talk about and make the practice of ePortfolios less high stakes, and make it more of a conversation. And also the resources, those color palette generators, I don't have them off the top of my head, but those types of resources are great for students and they're so easy to use. But they're not going to find, it would be hard for them to find that without making it explicit.
I'm going to just add a point, the accessibility issue that is becoming the boulder in our teaching, pedagogy, etc. I actually had a lot of pushback from students. When I was teaching FYE, I had them create a PowerPoint on accessibility. They had to figure out what it was, in text, this, that, and many of them just gave up. They just were like, no, why do I need to do this? So there's also that aspect of creating not empathy, but an understanding of their peers as different learners. And then when they go out into the workforce, say they have to give a presentation, They need to understand that the people in their workplaces or where they are selling their products may not be able to understand or access their presentations. So this accessibility issue is something that really needs to be roped in and help students understand why it's important, especially during this time of diversity and understanding culture clashes. And I could go on, but I'm going to stop.
I think that's really so important, Mel, and thank you for raising that. I think for sure it's something that we've all been thinking about. You know, I think the pandemic has really made us aware of a lot of things that maybe we weren't seeing before. And so so in that way, I think refreshing our own commitment to accessibility and using this moment to rethink where we are at as practitioners and then how we model that for students. You know, so if a student is giving you pushback, well, saying, but didn't you notice that, you know, my images have an alt caption and I have used captions and it was no big deal. And here's how I did it. But, you know, I think I just really feel like this is a moment that is going to push accessibility in UDL forward in a way that conversation had not been pushed forward before the pandemic in many arenas. Of course, there have always been incredible advocates for this and activists for this, but I feel like we're in a different moment now, which is great.
I don't want to cut our conversation short, but I do want to take just a second to share my screen again, because I wanted to make sure that I shared this. So we have a few links here. And like I said, you know, we gave you a link earlier to the materials, and that has this slide in there. But we have our next workshop on August 8th about visibility of labor. I don't have a shortened link for that, but it's in the same place that you found this one. And then the annual meeting for AAEEBL is in July. It's going to be completely virtual this year, so a lot of us will be there as well, talking about similar contexts. And then we also have a task force scholarship page. So we talk about this stuff a lot. We write about this. We come to presentations about this. So if you are looking for other resources, that's a good place to start. And I'm deep in a lit review for a class right now. So I will also say, like, if you're looking for other people to read about and learn from, those citations in our pages are really helpful. And also don't forget about the references that we have in the in the principles document as well. The last thing I wanted to make sure I shared is we would love your feedback. Full disclosure, the feedback form will also give you the option to hear from us more. We don't have time or energy to spam you with a lot of content, but we will share some upcoming things, hopefully in the future. So that email is there if you would like to reach out to us, and then also the bit.ly, so bit.ly/digital ethics feedback. We would love to hear from you.
And I also pop that in chat.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And then this is Liz and I's contact information. As we've said, please feel free to reach out. I will say it again, ePortfolio work can be siloed, it can be isolating. So we would love to support you however we can. And if we can't support you, we probably know someone who can. So please feel free to reach out. We have about 10 minutes left, so we will continue to hang out on here. But if you need to run to teach or to do anything at summer, if you're taking care of people, feel free to go. But like I said, Liz and I will hang out for the next 10 minutes to continue the conversation. But thank you all for coming and for taking time out of your summer day to be here.